Welcome to Convict Lives Australia. Today we are exploring the life of an English convict born in Stockport, Cheshire, who was transported to Van Diemen's Land in 1843 for her part in a violent robbery. Her name was Elizabeth Hallam. Unfortunately, I don't have a cemetery to visit to see Elizabeth's final resting place, but after learning about her through her husband's story, Robert Abbott's, I couldn't pass up the chance to tell you all about her. I am once again using some of the brilliant research gathered by the volunteers at the Female Convict Research Centre in Hobart. Elizabeth was born in 1826 and she was only 15 years old and working as a house girl when she was charged at the Lancashire Summer Assizes in Liverpool. She was convicted along with another girl, Sarah Jones, for stealing cigars and a watch, the property of one Joel Hart and James Rimmer. Her punishment was 15 years, transportation, quite a harsh sentence for one so young. 5 young men were also charged as accomplices to the crime, so Elizabeth was clearly associating with bad company. Now, many of the young men, boys really, who she'd been charged with, had already been charged multiple times with vagrancy, which makes me question, were they all living on the streets? It's possible. Elizabeth was put onto the transportation ship the Margaret, and the surgeon's report was less than flattering. It described Elizabeth as very dirty and untidy. Now, this may have been due to the fistula she had on her stomach, the poor girl. Also known as a gastrointestinal fistula, it is an abnormal connection between the stomach or the intestines and another organ or the skin, causing gastric fluids to leak out of the digestive tract. Elizabeth also suffered from psora. Now, it's a silent P, P-S-O-R-A. I'm assuming it's psora. It's an old medical term used in historical medical texts referring to scabies or a general skin disease, characterised by itching and scaling. So poor Elizabeth was indeed suffering, and it really does sound like she may have been living on the streets with this sort of gang of boys. I don't know. Anyway, the Margaret arrived in Van Diemen's Land in July of 1843, and 15-year-old Elizabeth was described as 5'4", 8 1/4 inches. She had a tattoo on her left shoulder with the initials IMJA, and she could neither read nor write. Elizabeth had one prior conviction for vagrancy before her transportation, so she'd certainly been doing it tough in her 15 years on the planet. She'd also been on the town for 2 weeks, and if you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know what that means. I'm not sure how she would have even endured that with the consequences of her fistula. It's too horrible to even think about. On arrival in Hobart, Elizabeth was taken to the Female House of Correction in Hobart, also known as the Female Factory, and she was put into second class. Elizabeth's first assignment was to a Mr. J. Collins near the town of Hamilton, north of Hobart. She received one punishment of 48 hours solitary for being drunk and out after hours. The next year, in 1845, Elizabeth had 3 private service assignments under the probation system. Introduced in 1843, the probation system replaced the older assignment system. Now, under this system, female convicts served a term of probation instead of being immediately assigned to settlers upon arrival. During their probation, they received moral and religious instruction and were trained in domestic skills like cooking, laundry, and service work. I don't know if this actually happened, but that was the plan. After completing probation and supposedly being reformed, they could work in private service as pass holders, earning wages without contributions from the Crown. Eventually, they could apply for a ticket of leave and later a conditional pardon. The system aimed to reform convicts through punishment and education, but faced issues like poor planning, overwhelming numbers, and economic struggles in the colony. Ultimately, it failed to meet its goals, leading to increased burdens on both convicts and settlers, and was abandoned in 1853 with the end of transportation to Van Diemen's Land. Elizabeth's first private assignment was to a Benjamin Walford of Launceston, lasting for 1 month. She then moved to another month-long engagement with George Colson of East Tamar. Finally, Elizabeth undertook a 3-month assignment with William Hutley of Launceston. In early 1846, Elizabeth was assigned to the Taylor family. However, she received a 1-month hard labour sentence at the Launceston Female Factory for disobeying orders. Later, she was placed with the Handcliffes, but absconded, resulting in a further 3-month hard labour sentence. According to researchers at the Female Convict Research Centre, women in the factory were typically employed in laundry and sewing, with the income contributing to the factory's upkeep. For Elizabeth, hard labour likely involved the wash tub, a secondary punishment imposed by magistrates. This was the only form of hard labour explicitly designated for female convicts in Tasmania. In early 1847, Elizabeth was assigned to the Holt family. It was here that she may have met a free man named George Flood, as the pair were granted permission to marry. However, I can find no record of their marriage and believe the event did not occur. Elizabeth took the opportunity to abscond from the Holts, and upon being caught, she was sentenced to 6 months of hard labour at the factory. Elizabeth's behaviour indicates that she may have been a part of a flash mob at the Launceston factory. If you want to learn more about the infamous flash mobs, watch my video on the life of Alan Scott. 4 months into her sentence, Elizabeth was put into solitary confinement for 14 days due to misconduct. The 24 solitary cells had been built the previous year by prisoners in punishment gangs, so male convicts basically, not by contracted workers. When probationary bricklayers misbehaved, they were sent to work on the cells. However, when there were no more bricklayers, the work stopped because no free labour was allowed. The convict department charged the British Treasury 6p per day for each prisoner working on the cells. In 1848 and 1849, Elizabeth had 2 more assignments, one with the Gough family and another with the McClanahans. She absconded both times and was given 2 6-month hard labour sentences. One was at the Launceston factory and the other at the Ross Female Factory. The Ross Female Factory operated from March 1848 to November 1854, serving as a factory, hiring depot, overnight station, lying-in hospital and nursery. It was needed in the interior to support female convicts working far from Launceston and Hobart and to reduce overcrowding in other factories. A Dr. Irvin was the superintendent and medical officer, and his wife was the matron at the Ross Female Factory. The death rate of babies and children was much lower at the Ross compared to other factories. While at the Ross Female Factory, Elizabeth's sentence was extended by 1 month for bringing money and tobacco into the factory. The following month, she received 3 days in the cells for the same offence. Elizabeth. A punishment in the cells meant that female convicts were isolated in small cells with strict control over their contact, comfort, exercise, diet and light. The harshest form involves sensory deprivation in dark, cramped cells. Whether it was solitary confinement, solitary on bread and water, or hard labour, the aim was the same: punitive and harsh short-term imprisonment. This could be done in any confined jail cell or purpose-built solitary cell. 2 months after her last punishment, she was given another 2-month hard labour sentence for having bread in her possession that she couldn't satisfactorily account for. I'm sure the convicts came up with lots of wild and wonderful ways to smuggle items in and out of their cells and prisons. No doubt deprivation will do that to you. A month later, Elizabeth was punished again with a 25-day sentence in the cells for absconding. And 2 months after that, she received another 4 days in the cells for disobeying an order. In April 1850, Elizabeth was granted a ticket of leave. Unfortunately, while en route to what was possibly an employment assignment, she was found drunk by a man named John Hunt in King Street, Campbelltown. And his testimony is as follows. She was drunk and I found a pass on her, and the pass had ordered her to go from Mr. Dixon's to somewhere the record doesn't say. She was very drunk. I wheeled her down in a wheelbarrow to the watch house, and she received 2 months of hard labour back at the Ross factory. So that's really not a good sign for poor Elizabeth. Now, around this time, Elizabeth met Robert Abbott, a fellow convict and former slave from British Guyana. You can learn all about Robert in a previous video I have made at the link below. Now, Robert had received his ticket of leave, and the pair were granted permission to marry on the 3rd of June 1851. I'm sure the powers that be thought that this would probably tame Elizabeth and give both of them more stability. And a month later, they were married at St. Joseph's Church in Launceston, officiated by the Reverend Thomas Butler. Unfortunately, St. Thomas's was later demolished and rebuilt as the Church of the Apostles on Margaret Street in Launceston. Elizabeth and Robert began their lives together, and no further misdemeanours were recorded against Elizabeth's name for over a year and a half, when she was fined 5 shillings for disturbing the peace. Now, things quieted down again for another year before Elizabeth was fined again twice in 1 month, once for being drunk and a few weeks later for disturbing the peace. Now, interestingly, around this time her husband Robert was working for a man named Mackenzie, and he was charged with behaving in a riotous and disorderly manner. So something was definitely happening in their lives that was upsetting them, possibly related to how Robert was being treated at his workplace, or maybe they were fighting each other. Unfortunately, I can find no more information about the situation. But Robert received 6 months of imprisonment and hard labour at the prison barracks in Launceston. Now, as Christmas neared and with Robert in jail, Elizabeth was fined another 5 shillings for using obscene language, so goodness knows what was happening. In April 1853, Elizabeth was fined 5 shillings for being drunk and received a 6-month hard labour punishment for larceny under £5, which I find interesting because maybe she really was struggling a lot more financially because Robert was in prison. A month later, her ticket of leave was revoked. Upon her release, she was assigned to her husband Robert. If a female convict was married, she could be assigned to her husband. This was seen as a way to maintain family units and provide stability. And I guess it would also be an excuse for convicts to get married because it would mean more freedom for both of them. So the husband had to apply for the assignment, and the authorities would consider factors such as the husband's character and ability to support his wife. So I find it very interesting that these two were given permission to marry, but also that Elizabeth could be assigned to Robert. I mean, this was 1853. Unfortunately, a year later, Elizabeth was sentenced to another 6 months of hard labour for indecent and disorderly behaviour. The year 1855 was even worse for Elizabeth, even though she had received a ticket of leave. Again, it is difficult to know exactly what was happening. She was in and out of the Launceston House of Correction and the Cascades Female Factory for misconduct and disorderly behaviour. The laws at the time were quite strict, especially for convicts. Disorderly conduct could include behaviours such as public drunkenness, fighting, using abusive language, or causing a public disturbance. So Elizabeth was definitely fiery. Elizabeth received 2 3-month hard labour sentences for being drunk and exposing herself. So was Elizabeth an alcoholic? It really does sound like that. 1856 was much the same. Elizabeth was assigned to her husband again, but spent 14 days in solitary confinement for 2 charges of drunkenness, and she received a 5-month hard labour sentence for being drunk again. Her ticket of leave was revoked again, and it is quite heartbreaking to see the spiral of addiction Elizabeth was in. Early 1857 was a bit better, with only 1 sentence of 3 months hard labour for being out after hours and using obscene language. Elizabeth was also issued a certificate of freedom. Her 15-year transportation sentence had been served. This certificate served as proof that a convict was no longer under penal servitude and was free to live and work as and where they pleased. They were also allowed to return to the United Kingdom if they could afford the journey. Obviously, many couldn't. But unfortunately, things completely unravelled in December of that year for Elizabeth. She was charged with unlawfully and maliciously stalking David Dawes in Hobart Town with intent to do him grievous bodily harm. A few days later, she was charged with cutting and wounding him in Providence Valley. She was given an 18-month hard labour sentence at the Female Factory in Hobart. The news reports of the incident provide a unique insight into Elizabeth's life and the shocking state she had fallen into. She was no longer living with Robert, or going by the name Abbott, but she'd moved in with an ex-convict named George Diltree. Now, George, originally from Halifax in the UK, had been sentenced to 15 years of transportation for a violent robbery, the same as Elizabeth. His convict report described him as very idle, insolent and troublesome. The pair were actually living with the man Elizabeth is accused of stabbing in a drunken moment, a blind man named David Dawes. David's testimony at the trial is as follows. This is taken from the Hobart Town Daily Mercury, Thursday the 15th of April 1858. And it says, the prosecutor, an old and infirm blind man, stated that he lived in Providence Valley and that the prisoner, Elizabeth, and her man, George Diltree, lived with him. They had both gotten drunk on Saturday night and kicked up a row on Sunday morning. David got up to call a neighbour when Elizabeth caught him at the door and stuck a knife into his hand. He pulled out the knife and out of her hand and threw it away, and he was sure it was a woman's hand. David then went to James Edbund's hut, so I'm assuming that's a neighbour, and afterwards to a hospital where his hand was dressed and it was not quite yet well. He was cross-examined by a Mr. Moriarty, and David said it was about 11 o'clock when I was stabbed. There was no ill feeling between me and Elizabeth. We all lived in one room and she attended on me. And he also says she made his bed for him sometimes. So I can assign no reason for the stabbing. I'm sure it was a woman's hand because a man's hand is bigger than a woman's. David continued, I had not struck Elizabeth that morning, so I think Elizabeth's testimony had been that David had actually hit her and that's why she stabbed him. But anyway, and David saying no, that he didn't do that. Dr. Cairns, said that David had came to him on the afternoon of the 6th of December and he was faint from loss of blood and had a stab in the back of the left wrist. The stab was not quite through, but it was deep. Now, the witness, James Ebden, who lived near David, stated that he was at his hut on the day in question and he saw David and Elizabeth and her husband. He called George her husband, but they weren't married. David had an open knife in his hand and Elizabeth was standing up and there was nothing the matter with the old man then. And according to James, Elizabeth lit her pipe and then she said to David Dawes, "You are like an old oyster man." And David had asked who she was talking to and she answered to him. And she was very drunk and she jabbed the knife into the old man's wrist as she was going out of the hut, apparently, according to James. Now, I don't know what an oyster man means, like an old fisherman. I think she was trying to insult him, I'm not sure. So James went again to the hut about an hour and a half later and he found the knife with the blood all over it. And he said that Elizabeth was lying down. And he said that what had first attracted him to the hut was all the cursing and swearing that he could hear inside by David Dawes and the female. He said but Dawes was not drunk. So the witness, James, was cross-examined by Mr. Moriarty and he said that Elizabeth had stabbed the old man and she said that she would kill 2 or 3 more before she had done, so she was in a state. The other man in the hut took no part in the dispute, and that other man was George Diltree. So Elizabeth was given an 18-month hard labour sentence at the Female Factory in Hobart. Elizabeth's time in prison certainly didn't tame her behaviour. We find her a couple of years later in May of 1862, and she was charged with using obscene language in a street in Green Ponds. Now, Green Ponds is now known as the town of Kempton. It's a small town north of Hobart on the Midlands Highway towards Launceston. and she was fined 5 shillings. Elizabeth must have been living and possibly working in the area, because a year later she was again in trouble for stealing a quantity of potatoes and mangold wurzels valued at 6 pence, the property of one Thomas Parsons of Constitution Hill. Elizabeth pled not guilty but was given a 1-month sentence of hard labour anyway. Now, does anyone know what mangold wurzels are? I certainly didn't. I had to Google it, and they are a type of root vegetable similar to beets. So usually used to feed animals, but humans can eat them too. So I'd say this indicates Elizabeth's state of poverty at that time. A few months later, she was again charged by Thomas Mealer of Kempton with stealing 1 cotton handkerchief valued at 6 pence, 2 pounds of sugar valued at 8 pence, and 1 knife valued at 1 shilling, and other articles with a total value of 5 shillings, the property of Thomas Mealer. Now, the charge was discharged due to the lack of evidence. But unfortunately, only a few days later, Elizabeth was charged again with disturbing the public in a street. I shouldn't laugh, but it's kind of funny, but not really. Okay, so she pleaded guilty and was fined 20 shillings or 14 days of hard labour. And then it says she was committed, which I assume meant she chose the 14 days of hard labour, as I don't believe she would have been able to afford the money to avoid the sentence. It is interesting to note, though, that since her 18-month hard labour sentence for the stabbing, she was again going by the name Elizabeth Abbott. What does that mean? I do not know. In 1866, Elizabeth was 40 years old, and she was charged with being on the premises of a William Palmer of Constitution Hill for some unlawful purpose. Look, she was probably trying to find more potatoes to steal. She would have been in desperate circumstances, and her health would have been terrible. It says Elizabeth was unable to attend court on account of a bad leg. So there was also a second charge of obscene language, which will surprise no one. But the charge of obscene language was withdrawn, and she was only charged 5 shillings for the trespass. This is the last account and record I can find of Elizabeth. There are no records of her remarrying or of her death in Tasmania. 40 years old is still quite young, although Elizabeth would have had, her health would not have been great. And it isn't beyond the realms of possibility that she did remarry, but I can't find anything. She was going obviously by the name Elizabeth Abbott, although there is no evidence that she was back with Robert, and she certainly did not marry George Dealtree either. So another likelihood is that she died a pauper, and she's buried in a pauper's grave in either Kempton, Launceston or Hobart. Now, if something nefarious happened to her, as we know, she didn't keep the best of company, I can find no reports of her going missing or anything like that. But if you do know what happened to Elizabeth, be sure to let us all know in the comments. But for now, we remember Elizabeth Hallam. Despite her life being filled with turmoil and suffering, she is one of the founding mothers of Australia, a part of our unique convict history.